On the 30th of June 2002, the whole world tuned in for the 2002 World Cup final between Brazil and Germany. Brazil would add the 5th star to their badge by beating a German side who, despite having an easy run to the final, had never looked convincing throughout the entire tournament by a comfortable scoreline of 2-0, with Ronaldo, the tournament's top goalscorer, scoring both of them. However, on the same day but a few hours prior, another match of epic proportions was taking place that later went on to be dubbed as the Worst Cup, with the teams involved not being titans of the world game or even underachievers who'd failed to qualify for the World Cup in Japan and South Korea. Instead, it would be between the two lowest ranked sides in FIFA's world rankings at the time, by the names of Bhutan and Montserrat. And as you might have guessed by the title, and indeed the introduction, I'm going to cover the story of this game in all its glory, which was later turned into a documentary entitled The Other Final. It really was an occasion which proved that football, and indeed sport as a whole, is not always about winning or entitlement to success. Florentino Perez take notes, but more about the joy of playing, the experiences shared with others, and the cultural relations which can stem from just a single game, perhaps epitomising the notion of football really being the beautiful game. So without any further ado, let's explore the so-called other final between Bhutan and Montserrat, which took place in 2002. Both teams are, to put it lightly, minnows on the international scene, and they have been ever since their respective FA's foundations. Bhutan's was the first out of the two to be established, as they set theirs up in 1983, some 11 years before Montserrat took that step, but both have suffered from various problems when it comes to sporting development within their countries, which ultimately led them to this point of taking part in the other final. We'll start off by looking at Bhutan, a mountainous, landlocked Asian nation which borders Tibet to the north and some Indian states to its south. The principal sport in the country at the start of the 21st century, and perhaps even still to this day, was archery, but by 2002, only 12 sports even had their own federation within the country, although football, of course, was one of them. Despite sports popularity as a whole being extremely high amongst Bhutan's populace, the facilities were generally underdeveloped, as money that could have been funneled into sporting development by the government was instead put towards more pressing areas such as basic amenities for the population and preserving the cultural heritage of the nation. This meant that sporting organisations were habitually uncoordinated and disorganised, and sports which prioritised the individual over the team, such as archery, taekwondo and boxing, were more popular amongst the public simply because they were easier to run and fund, and thus more fervently propagated by the government. As such, during the 1980s and 1990s, football suffered a slump in both popularity and quality, even though the current king father of Bhutan and the incumbent monarch back in 2002 had been a goalkeeper himself during the 1970s. Talk about a switch of career. The national team had played its first match in 1982, losing 3-1 to Nepal, and in the 20 years that followed, they played a further 17 matches, but lost every single one of them, including being tonked 20-0 by Kuwait back in 2000. That was the year in which they gained FIFA affiliation, so they didn't really make a good account of themselves on a public scale with that defeat, but it made them the newest team in FIFA's roster by the time 2002 rolled around. Even in spite of their wretched form, they still found themselves in just second to last in the FIFA World Rankings, just ahead of 203rd placed Montserrat. Montserrat is almost the polar opposite to Bhutan, in that it is an island nation located in the Caribbean, extremely small, with a population of just 4,649 people at the latest count, and predominantly Christian, with Bhutan being the only predominantly Buddhist nation on Earth. One similarity that they do have is that football is neither country's most popular sport, as Montserrat prefer the classic bat and ball game of cricket, although a football team representing the nation had played 2 games in the 1950s, albeit they lost both of them. Between 1990 and 1995, Montserrat played 11 games and not only drew one of them against Anguilla, but also beat the same opponents twice during 1995 CONCACAF Cup qualifying, only to be put in their place by losing 20-0 on aggregate in the next round to St Vincent and the Grenadines. However, something far more tragic than that was to happen in 1995, as the Soufriere Hills volcano became active, forcing thousands of people to evacuate their homes or relocate to the UK. The entire southern half of the island is still uninhabitable to this day and designated as an exclusion zone, and all barring one of the country's football pitches have been completely wiped out in the eruption. The national team wouldn't play any more matches until 1999, and they only played one home game in any form between 1995 and 2012 as a result of the damage that had been done. The country was still bearing heavy scars from the disaster by 2002, with income having dried up, British aid needing to be provided at all times, and ash still being highly prevalent in the atmosphere, which meant that Montserratian players, all 150 of them registered as amateur, had to take breaks during games and training because of sore eyes. What you may be able to deduce from all of this is that the only auspicious thing about these countries' footballing histories from an international standpoint was that they were both completely inauspicious, apart from the fact that they were affiliates of FIFA and not really very good. Therefore, one might rightly ask the question of why this match happened in the first place, considering not only were they polar opposites in terms of their respective cultures, but also the two worst international teams at that time, according to FIFA at the very least. So, how did it come about? Well, it was primarily down to a couple of Dutch filmmakers by the names of Matthijs de Jongh and Johan Kramer, who went on to release the film The Other Final through Kramer's production company. De Jongh and Kramer, seeing their own nation, the Netherlands, somehow failed to qualify for the World Cup, despite reaching the semi-finals of Euro 2000 2 years prior and boasting a squad with big names such as Patrick Kluivert, Edwin van der Sar, Edgar Davids, Jaap Stam, Mark Overmars, Clarence Seedorf, Ruud van Nistelrooy. You get the idea. In the documentary, de Jongh states that they became almost addicted to losing as a result of their national team's plight during the qualification process, with Kramer adding in an interview with FIFA that he, quote, loved the stories of outsiders in football, close quote, and with that, they turned their attentions to finding out who were the worst national football teams at that moment. They looked up the FIFA World Rankings online, and sure enough, right at the very bottom of them were the names of Bhutan and Montserrat, who had accrued just 13 and 9 points respectively. Although considering Bhutan had lost every match in their entire existence, I have absolutely no idea where they managed to get those 13 points from, or how they were above Montserrat, given that the Islanders had actually won 2 separate games since joining FIFA. With this, their respective light bulbs were lit, and an idea came to try to organise a game between these two teams to determine who really was the worst team in the world. Apparently, the original plan was to actually get the Bhutanese national team to face off against Ajax, who of course hail from the same country as the pair of filmmakers, but the former refused the offer. As a result, after that idea fell through, de Jongh and Kramer decided to try to pair up Bhutan with Montserrat for a potential one-off match, and fired off faxes to both FAs to see whether or not they would both be up for it. Montserrat responded immediately, confirming their interest, although it would take a few extra weeks for Bhutan to respond, but eventually they too signalled their interest to take part in this particular game. This was an interesting turn of events for the Asian nation, as normally they restrict tourists from entering the country in order to protect its heritage, but on this occasion they, and especially the on-watching public, were very keen. Of course, arranging an international match for the sake of it isn't as simple as that, and as Montserrat started to have doubts about taking part as a result of the extortionate finances involved, de Jongh planned to travel to the nation in order to fully convince them in the project. In the meantime, he had to obtain FIFA's official permission to allow the game to go ahead, so he visited them on his way to Montserrat, positing that it would be the epitome of their motto of "for the love of the game," and FIFA accepted his proposal, provided that he could ensure that the match would fall under official international rules. Although de Jongh had brought FIFA's seal of approval with him to Montserrat, their players were still uncertain as to what it would do for them and the footballing scene on the island, and the subsequent rift that emerged between the FA and their players and the manager, Paul Morris, led to the latter resigning from his post. The players almost went too in solidarity with Morris, but he encouraged them to stick around and not waste the opportunity at their disposal, and after being told that all of the profits made would go into funding football in both countries and that all expenses would be covered by the respective filmmakers, they invested themselves completely in the idea. Bhutan, on the other hand, once they had accepted the original offer, had no such qualms about taking part amongst either their public or their team, and they would prepare themselves for the match by playing unofficial games against club sides in countries such as India, Thailand, Nepal and South Korea. However, tragedy would strike merely a matter of weeks before the big game was due to take place, as their manager, Kang Byung-chan, suddenly died, meaning that Bhutan had to desperately search for a manager to guide their team. They found one from the Netherlands by the name of Adi Shans, whose most high-profile role had been manager of Dutch amateur side KVV in 2001, becoming the first Dutch manager to be appointed full-time by an amateur club in the process. He made the team train for 4 hours every single day, more than the Bhutanese players, all of whom are amateur, were used to, and he was confident going into the match, stating that they would beat the Islanders by at least 2 goals. Montserrat, who were the more physical side, responded in turn by stating that they would emerge victorious very handsomely, potentially by a scoreline of 3 goals or more. And so the day came, the 30th of June 2002, to supposedly determine once and for all who was apparently the worst team in the world. Anywhere between 15,000 and 25,000 turned out for the occasion at the Changlimitan Stadium, eager to see which one of these two nations would get the upper hand. And by the way, this is the Changlimitan Stadium, and I think you'll all agree that is pretty stunning. Before the match, further positive relations were established between the two nations once more, as the Bhutanese public put on a traditional dance show 1 hour prior to the match beginning for their visitors, and as the teams walked onto the pitch, the fans chanting the song Hot Hot Hot, which was Montserrat's most popular song. The referee for this game was ex-Premier League referee Steve Bennett, who had been handpicked by FIFA themselves to officiate the game, showing how big the interest in the game was, and indeed would prove to be. Straight away, the conditions favoured the Bhutanese, as the beautiful Changlimitan Stadium is around 7,500 feet above sea level, and they were therefore well adjusted to the climate and the lower levels of oxygen that the stadium provided, whereas Montserrat's highest point is atop the Sulphur Hill volcano at just 3,440 feet, with most of the inhabitable land being close to sea level. As you would expect, the Montserratian players struggled to cope with the altitude, and 8 of their players were unable to take part in the game owing to various illnesses and especially altitude sickness brought on by the climate. They very nearly withdrew again at the last minute, but a Dutch photographer showed their captain, Charles Thompson, the baying Bhutanese fans who were packed into the stadium, and his opinion was swayed once again, even in spite of a depleted squad. However, it would be Montserrat who made the strongest start in the opening exchanges, but within 5 minutes, any Bhutanese nerves were settled when Wangai Dorji, who had only recently recovered from an eye infection, managed to slot home. Although there was sustained pressure from both sides in the game, there wouldn't be another goal until the 65th minute, when the hosts, and specifically Dorji, added a second from a stunning free kick. The third and killer goal came 10 minutes later, as the veteran Dinesh Shetty made it 3-0 before Dorji completed his hat-trick in the final few moments of the game to round off a 4-0 win for Bhutan. The match didn't pass without incident though, as a dog wandered onto the pitch partway through the game, and it took a while for it to be escorted off the pitch, but it only added to the entertainment value that the game provided. It was Bhutan's first ever win in their entire history, but in all honesty, the result was secondary, with the primary aspect of this whole exercise being that the popularity of the sport in both countries grew exponentially, especially Bhutan, as football is apparently now the second, or perhaps even the most popular sport, just behind, or level with, or even perhaps ahead of, archery. In spite of this, the Bhutanese public didn't actually want their team to win, according to Kramer, instead preferring a draw, and they even went so far as to cheer on their opponents in the hope that they would score, but the result did nonetheless lift them into the top 200 of FIFA's World Rankings for the first time, with Montserrat remaining nailed to the bottom of them. The relations between both countries became even more cordial in the aftermath of the match, as both sets of players sat together to watch the actual World Cup final take place in Yokohama, and later on, a joint stamp for both nations in honour of the match was commissioned. The documentary from de Jongh and Kramer was released a year later, gaining endorsements from the likes of Zinedine Zidane and Roberto Baggio, and winning the Avignon Film Festival Award for the Best Documentary in 2003. Both de Jongh and Kramer have said that it was the best project they have ever embarked on, with the latter also stating that they would love to see that kind of match happen again on a regular basis, which at the moment would consist of Anguilla and San Marino. I know I'd definitely watch that. Above all else though, it was the occasion which showcased the true beauty of sport, and especially football, which would have been completely lost had the European Super League gone ahead. It doesn't really matter whether you win or lose, but as long as you go out on the pitch and give it your all, who knows where it can take you. In the case of Bhutan and Montserrat's players, their perceived failures in previous matches had inadvertently led them to play against each other, two contrasting countries who previously couldn't identify the other on a global map, but who managed to improve their cultural interactions with others as a result of just one football match. Proof, if ever it was needed, that sport can, and indeed always should, bring people together in perfect harmony, irrespective of who you are. And that corny ending just about wraps up this mini documentary on an actual documentary entitled The Other Final, which covered the famous game, or now famous game, between Bhutan and Montserrat in 2002. And if you did enjoy this video, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and you can ring the little notification bell to get notified whenever I upload a video straight away. And if you have any other things that you would like me to profile, maybe famous matches or anything like that, stick them down in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you then.